A couple weeks ago, Microsoft's Japan office experimented with a 4-day work week. They decided to do away with working on Friday and instead said, all right, all of our workers are going to come Monday through Thursday. Friday we're going to be closed down, and we'll see what happens with all of that. Well, in addition to finding that their costs were decreased because they didn't have to have the building with all the electricity and everything on Friday, they also found that productivity went up 40%. So they knocked off an entire work day and went up 40% in what they were able to produce during that time of working. And the best they could determine was that because their employees knew that they were going to have an extra day to stop, to not be overburdened, to not be overworked, to rest, their productivity went up by 40%. Rest is really important. They were able to find that out through this little experiment. And rest being this important concept, it's one that's discussed all throughout Scripture. There's a word in the Psalms. Your translations may not have this. It may not be there for you. Sometimes we eliminate it when we read through the Psalms. We just kind of overlook it and don't include it. And that word is Selah. We're not really sure exactly what it means, but most people who study these things, the scholars who look at this kind of stuff, come down to this has to have been some kind of musical notation. And the best they can determine is that this is it's a rest. Similar to what we do, or what we saw in the songs that we've sung this morning, that stop, don't sing anything here, just pause. Though for them it would have been a little different. For us it was stop singing entirely. This is where we rest, take a breath here, and then get ready for the next part. For those in the Psalms, which were songs that they sung, but there were also things that they read, those would have been reminders, that word Selah, to say, stop, think about what you just said before you move on to the next thing. Rest in what you just stated about who God is. Rest in what you just said about how you should worship and praise and look at Him. I want us to talk about rest this morning and the significance of that rest to God to begin with, and the significance of that rest in our life, in our lives as Christians. I want to start with this fact here. God created rest. This isn't some idea of people. It isn't just something that lazy people want to say, well, I want to have more rest. Rest is something God made from the very beginning. Over 150 times throughout the Bible, you're going to see the word Sabbath. It's talked about in a number of different ways. It even breaks down kind of nicely for us. About 100 times in the Old Testament, Sabbath is mentioned, and about 50 times in the New Testament, this idea of Sabbath is mentioned. And in the Old Testament, we see it more so with the law, particularly Exodus and Leviticus, where it's explaining what the Sabbath is all about and why it's so important. And in the New Testament, we see it in the Gospels of Jesus being talked to about the Sabbath, talking about the Sabbath, and how all of that was supposed to work. I want to focus in on a couple places with this point here. The first is going to be a couple places in Exodus where they are first given the law about the Sabbath. When they're given the 10 Commandments, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, that's what we remember. That's that commandment that was given to them. That's the one that we remember. But there's a lot that comes after that that explains why the Sabbath is significant to Israel. And when Moses is giving the law from God to the people of Israel, telling them about the Sabbath, he stops and says, here's why God has said this is so significant. We read this. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And then again in Exodus chapter 31, the Sabbath is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed. When they are first told about the Sabbath and why they need to keep the Sabbath, they're reminded that God created Sabbath rest when He stopped to rest Himself. There at the end of the week of creation, God stops and rests, whether he needs it or not. And that Exodus 31 verse is very interesting to talk about for another time. Whether he needs it or not, he stopped to take a look back at the week that was there. And when he tells the people of Israel, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, it's because God created that time of rest for you to do nothing. So they're given this law, they're given the Sabbath as one of the 10 commandments and other commandments as they leave Egypt, and they end up hearing all of this, and then they grumble and complain, and they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And in Deuteronomy, right before they're about to head into the Promised Land through Joshua, through that whole book and watching them take over the Promised Land, they are retold the laws of God so that as they walk into the Promised Land, they can say, all right, we're aware exactly what God wants, and we're going to go and do those things. Now, they don't do a great job of that, but they were given another chance. Here's what we read in Deuteronomy about the Sabbath. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Here, now God gives them this commandment for the Sabbath and doesn't say, well, remember I rested on the seventh day, but remember what I brought you out of, because you're about to head into the Promised Land. Remember where I took you out of. Slaves in the land of Egypt, you were overburdened, overworked, you were stressed, you were even being killed over the work that you were asked to do. And remember that I delivered you from that when you keep this Sabbath day. Over and over again, they're told to remember that day every week, to stop and rest, and like the word Selah in the Psalms, think about what God has done for you and nothing more. We want to treat rest like it's a bad word. I've talked to a lot of people who think rest is just not a good thing. Okay, you can rest when you're dead. Okay, well, rest is something God's made. Yes, there's work to be done. Yes, there are more things that you could do. If you want to be busy, you can be busy. But God has created rest. It's not some bad word. It's a tool that God has given us, that He's created for us, because God knows all the way from the beginning that we need that well-being, that we need this time to stop and say, okay, God, I need to recharge so that I can keep going for you moving forward. God created rest. But even more than that, and we've seen this a little bit, God Himself rested. We see this in a couple places. We see God the Father do this, and I want to note that in Genesis 2 in just a moment. We're also going to see it with Jesus there in the Gospels in Mark chapter 4. And both of these are very interesting. Notice Genesis 2, 1-3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that He had done in creation. We want to, very often, I do this as well, I don't need to rest. I can keep going. There's other things that need to take place. I don't know that God needed to rest, but He does. And notice what He says here in Genesis 2, 1-3, right there about the middle. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Why is the seventh day blessed and holy? Why is it this set-apart special day? What makes the Sabbath special? Because on it God rested. That's it. And if God says, I'm going to rest, then who am I to say, well, okay, God needed to take a rest, but I don't need to take a rest? It's not how it works. Why is the Sabbath holy? Why does God tell Israel, remember the Sabbath? Because He rested Himself, and He knows that Israel is going to want to resist some of that. They need to know God, who does not need rest, understands the importance of it. To look back, to appreciate what you have done instead of thinking about all the things that need to be done. We see this even more with Jesus in Mark chapter 4. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" There's a lot of action going on in this scene. You have this great storm that's coming up. They're all hopping into boats. And it notes that around the boat that Jesus is in, there are also all these other boats. So this crowd that's following him, they're hopping in boats. They're wanting to travel along with all this. As they're going along, here comes this great windstorm. And they're being thrown around. The waves are so tall or so fierce that the water is getting into the boat. The boat is going to sink if they don't do something fast. They're all very concerned to the point where they cry out to the teacher, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Because it says Jesus here is asleep on the cushion while all this is going on. I've been on a boat. Maybe a couple. There's one that really sticks out in my mind. I slept on that boat, but it was only after I pretty well passed out. If I moved, I was going to continue to get sick. I don't know how you sleep on a cushion while you're being thrown back and forth. But here's Jesus through all of this, asleep. Gets up, calms the storm, probably goes back to sleeping right after. We don't know. But there's more than just the great storm that's going on here. Leaving the crowd. Before they set sail, this great crowd that's been following Jesus is there. And they're getting on the boat, knowing that there's a crowd there, and saying, "We're going to get on the boat, we're going to go to this other side." And Jesus sees all those people. You know what he's seeing in all those people? There are more miracles to be done in that crowd. There are more sick people that need healing in that crowd. There are probably blind people in that crowd. There are lame people in that crowd. There are people who need to eat in that crowd. There are lessons that need to be taught to that crowd. But Jesus says, "I need to rest." Yes, there's more work to be done here. It was just mentioned a moment ago in our Lord's Supper devotional. Think about Jesus' to-do list. You think you're busy? You think Jesus could have always just been doing things? When we see Jesus, he is always doing things. And he finds these moments to rest. Well, it's not that he didn't have anything to do anymore. He still had work to do, and the crowds are going to follow him. Once they get right off the boat, here's the crowd again. Come teach us, come heal us, come do miracles, come talk to us, come listen to us. Jesus knows, yeah, there's work to be done, but there's rest that needs to be had first. So he hops on the boat to sleep on the cushion to rest. We like to be loaded up. We like to look around at what needs to be done, and I'm grateful for this attitude. What more can I see? Where do people need my help? Where does the church need my help? Where do my neighbors need my help? Where does my job need my help? What do my kids need help with? What do my kids want to do? What do I want to do? And we fill up our schedules looking for all these things that we can try and cram in there. And we get to the point where we have to say, no, I can't do this, can't do these things, can't do these other things. Not because we're setting up boundaries, but because the schedule's just been so crammed that we just can't physically do anymore. But we forgot to take time to go sleep on the cushion, to go stop and rest. We look at all the work that's around us and say, how can I do more and be involved? And there's a noble aspect to that. But if God the Father goes and creates all week long and says, I'm going to rest now. And if Jesus the Son, God in the flesh, comes to the earth and he's involved in ministry nonstop with crowds of people, every town he goes in, it's just more and more crowds of people. If he needs to rest, even though there's all this work to be done, why can't we do the same? We've got to remember that creation, that rest is a creation of God, that it's a tool from God for us to be able to recharge and get back to right where we need to be. Here's the last part. God's created rest. God rested himself. Third, God provides rest for us now. At the end of Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says some words that are going to be very familiar to us. But all through that chapter, there are messengers from John the Baptist. They want to find out more information about Jesus. Is this it? Because they're going to lose John here soon. Have we got it right? Did John get it correct? And they go and talk to Jesus. Jesus spends all this time talking to them about, no, you got, this is it. I'm the right one. He was doing the right thing. You've got it all together. And then immediately following that, you have Jesus thinking about the cities that are there in the area. Bethsaida, all these other towns that he can see. And he's thinking about all the works that he's done in those places. And he says about them, if the things I did in your towns had been done in places like Sodom and Gomorrah, which is known for its destruction, if these things had been done in places like Tyre and Sidon, which is another area that they would have recognized for its destruction, if I had done those things in those places, they would have repented a long time ago. And Jesus says to all these towns that he's observing, you're ignoring. You're not getting it. The messengers from John, they wanted to know, do we get it? Do we understand who you are? The towns aren't getting it. And at the end of chapter 11 in Matthew, Jesus stops and takes a moment to talk to the Lord and then turns out to the people that are there with him. Here's what we read. At that time, Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. I want to pause there for just a moment. Listen to what's being said. You have all throughout the chapter, are you the right one? Are you the Messiah? Were we doing this right? Was John right? Did we get it there? Yes, you got it. I am the one. This is right. And if only these cities would have understood. And then he turns and talks to God and says, Father, I thank you that those that are these little children, he talks about the wise and understanding and then the little children. The wise and understanding, especially when you get into Matthew 12 and what's happened prior to this in Matthew 10, the wise and understanding are those that have been taught by those religious people of that day, the Pharisees, the scribes, who have said, here, let me tell you all about God, but it's not about God, it's using God and taking his word to get across what the Pharisees want to have across, because they want the power. And so you have all these people who are looking at Jesus and saying, well, he's not a war leader, he's not a king, he's not all these things that we're expecting. They're wise and understanding, but they don't get it. They've been led in the wrong direction. And it's the little children, those that don't have all of this teaching from the scribes and Pharisees that have just been laid into them. It's those that are just looking at Jesus and saying, okay, this is what's standing before me. This has got to be who this is. And then he ends all of this saying, no one knows the Son except for the Father, and no one knows the Father except for the Son, and everyone that the Son chooses to reveal him to. And then here's what we read. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Talked about the wise and understanding. Those are the people that are laboring, are heavy laden. They have on them the yoke of those that were teaching them. And when you get into Matthew chapter 12, and it's a great thing for you to read kind of as an accompaniment with all of this. In Matthew 12, we immediately begin talking about the Sabbath. And the Pharisees say, your disciples are breaking the Sabbath law. Why? Because as they're walking along, they grab some pieces of grain, crush it up, and then eat the stuff inside of it. They're not resting. But that was never God's Sabbath intention at all. In fact, the Pharisees had made that such a strict thing that the idea of resting became a serious burden. Because everybody all day long during the Sabbath at that time was questioning, am I breaking God's law? Am I breaking God's law? I just shouldn't get up. I should just lay here. I shouldn't do anything at all because I'm going to break God's law and I'm going to sin against it. They had turned even a great day of rest into this horrible, heavy burden. And Jesus says, all of you who are living under that, come to me. Instead of listening to their teaching, come listen to mine. Take my yoke. Throw theirs off. It's too heavy. They don't have the right to put that on you. And they say that it's what God is putting on you, but it's not what God's putting on you. Just prior to this, he says, the Father has given me the authority. And Jesus says, listen, that they don't have the authority to put that on you. Throw that off. Take my yoke on you. Learn from me. Take my teaching on you because I'm going to tell you what the Father is saying. They're getting it wrong. For I am gentle and lowly in heart. You'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Still a yoke, still a burden, but it's easy and light. And notice here what Jesus says is the result of following him instead of these other people that are around them. I will give you rest. You'll find rest for your souls. Big contrast with what the Pharisees were giving them. Their souls are crushed. They are desperate to know who the Father is, and they can't. Because they can hardly move. The yoke is so heavy, they're pinned to the ground, they can't move forward. That's all they want. Help me to know God. And the Pharisees are saying, well, here's how you do it, and giving them more than what they're supposed to. And Jesus says, listen, that's not the right way. If your soul's being crushed, that's not the right way to God. The right way to God leads to rest for your souls. This next comment is not going to be very popular. This doesn't apply to everybody. I am sure that I am talking to people who are tired, and I don't mean it's too early or I didn't get enough sleep last night. I mean, I know that there are people who are overburdened, stressed out, feels like there's just too much. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So this may very well not apply to you, but it might apply to some of us, and so it needs to be said. If the life you are living for Christ is wearing you out, you're overburdened by living the Christ life, you might be living a Christianity measured not by Jesus' standards, but by the standard of others, or by your own standard. Jesus, in his way to God, has said, you'll find rest. You're not going to find stress. Rest for your souls. And again, there are a lot of reasons we could be overburdened. There are a lot of things that could exist in the world to cause us to do that, even in Christianity. But it's worth asking the question, am I trying to live the Christianity that Jesus has given me, or am I trying to live the Christianity that I think He's given me? Am I serving God because, well, look at what this person over here is doing, why can't I also be doing that? And then over here, she's doing this, and so why can't I be doing that as well? And he's doing this and so I'm going to get more involved, and I'm going to keep doing more and more things, whether I want to or not, because I'm going to serve the Lord, and then you find yourself completely overburdened and worn out, and maybe not even wanting to go on with Christianity. That is not the Christianity of Christ. That is the Christianity of the pressure from others and bearing their load of what they think you should be doing for Christ, or the pressure of yourself and what you think you should be doing for Christ. If that life that you're living for God is causing you to be worn out, you might not be living by Jesus' standard. We began this lesson talking about the 4-day work week of Microsoft's Japan office. They didn't just decide, you know what, let's do something fun. Let's mix it up a little bit. Let's cut off one of the work days, see what happens. They were prompted to do so for a number of reasons. In 2015, there was a Japanese man who on Christmas Day, because of his overwork, decided to take his own life. It's too much. He couldn't get enough rest, and so that's how he handled that. That was in 2015. In 2017, a reporter died after logging 159 hours of overtime work in the month before. She worked herself to death. She didn't get enough rest. In fact, in Japan, they've coined a new term, karoshi. It means death by overwork. The way that the culture has operated for too long, everybody feels like, okay, if they're doing this, then I need to stay longer, and I can keep pushing the company forward. And if we all just do more and more and more overtime, they've had to pass laws to greatly restrict to under 800 hours of overtime within a year, because people would continually push and push and push, and as a result, people were dying from lack of rest. You see where I'm going with this? If you're wondering, okay, why don't I love God like I'm supposed to? Why does, when I hear about His sacrifice for me, why doesn't it hit like it used to? Why isn't it more jarring for me when I think about that? That somebody died for me, even though I didn't deserve it. That He died because of what I did and was grateful to do it. Why doesn't that resonate with me like it did at one point? Because you need to rest. Because the overwork and the looking around at other people and what they're doing and wanting to be a part of that and saying, well, I just need to do more, I need to keep going, I need to keep adding more to all of this, it's killing you. And then we end up showing up and saying, well, I need to be there, but it just doesn't feel right. We got to rest. This is the part of the sermon where I would give you something to say, all right, here is the little action we can take this week to try and live out the principle that we've seen. We need to rest, so here's what we can do to rest. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do this week. Do nothing. See, some of you before are like, well, I've never done any of the things that he suggested, but I think I can get on board with this guy this week. Find a moment to say, all right, I'm gonna get up a little earlier, just sit there with my coffee, and just let it be quiet. I'm gonna go take a moment to stare out my back window and just look at the creation around me. and just pause. Go and sit down with a book, or don't sit down with a book, just sit down and just sit there for a little bit and rest in what God has done for you. Go and take a seat next to your children and just sit there with them. Think about what God has put next to you. Find the time to do nothing and rest. To everyone who is tired or stressed out or overworked, overburdened, burnt out, the words of Jesus are still coming to us today. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus still invites you to that today. In Him there is rest. We want to help you find that. And if you don't know who Jesus is, or you know who Jesus is, but you're not with Jesus yet, we want to help you find the rest that comes with knowing Him. And if you're one of those who have experienced His rest at some point, but right now there's just too much, we want to help you untangle that. Remove the yoke that other people or that you've placed on yourself, and just get back to the easy and light burden Jesus has placed on you.